The spring sun was setting over downtown Atlanta, casting long shadows between the gleaming skyscrapers. The weekend traffic had thinned out, leaving the streets relatively peaceful. A black Mercedes S-Class glided smoothly through the intersection, its driver just leaving a fundraiser for the local children's hospital. Behind the wheel sat a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. A small smile played on his face as he thought about the successful event where they'd raised over $100,000 for new medical equipment. He'd treated himself to this car just 2 weeks ago, after 20 years of dedicated service to the justice system. The new car smell still lingered, mixing with the leather interior. His father's old pocket watch, passed down through generations, sat in the cup holder, a reminder of how far their family had come from the days when his dad worked 3 jobs to put him through law school. A few blocks behind him, a young police officer sat in his patrol car, finishing up paperwork from an earlier call. He was nearing the end of his first year on the force, still eager to prove himself to his superiors. When the Mercedes passed by, something made him look up. He couldn't quite explain what caught his attention. Maybe it was the expensive car in this part of town, or maybe it was just instinct. Either way, he found himself running the plates through the system. The registration came back to an address in Riverside Heights, one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. The officer drummed his fingers on his steering wheel, a habit he'd developed during long nights on patrol. Something didn't feel right to him, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. Making a quick decision, he pulled out into traffic and began following the Mercedes. The driver of the Mercedes noticed the patrol car in his rearview mirror. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when he was being followed. His hands instinctively gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, and he made sure to maintain exactly the speed limit. Years of experience had taught him to stay calm in situations like this, but he couldn't help feeling a familiar knot forming in his stomach. The police car's lights flashed to life, painting the surrounding buildings in rotating blue patterns. The Mercedes driver let out a small sigh and carefully pulled over to the curb, making sure to position his car well out of traffic. He turned off the engine but left his hands visible on the steering wheel, a routine he learned decades ago from his own father. The young officer parked behind the Mercedes, calling in the stop to dispatch. He adjusted his body camera and stepped out of his patrol car, hand resting near his weapon. Standard procedure, he'd been taught. The evening air was cool against his face as he approached the driver's side window, flashlight beam bouncing off the spotless black paint. Inside the car, the driver took slow, measured breaths. He could see the officer's silhouette growing larger in his side mirror. The situation felt eerily familiar. He'd been here before, too many times to count. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't a law student or a young attorney or even a newly appointed judge. This time, he carried with him decades of experience on both sides of the law. The officer's boots crunched on the small bits of gravel by the curb, the sound seeming unusually loud in the quiet street. His flashlight beam swept across the interior of the expensive car, taking in the immaculate leather seats and the driver's crisp suit. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his mind, but he pushed it aside. He'd been trained to trust his instincts, and something about this situation just didn't add up in his mind. Neither man knew it yet, but this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. In the next few minutes, assumptions would be challenged, biases would be exposed, and a powerful lesson about justice and prejudice would begin to unfold on this quiet Atlanta street. The officer cleared his throat as he reached the driver's window. License, registration, and proof of insurance, he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority all new officers develop. The beam of his flashlight swept across the car's interior again, lingering on the expensive leather seats. The driver kept his hands on the steering wheel, speaking in a measured tone that came from years of courtroom experience. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" His voice was calm, but carried a natural weight of authority that came from decades of professional experience. "I'll get to that," the officer replied, his tone growing slightly harder. "First, I need to see those documents. He noticed the driver's expensive watch, the perfectly pressed suit, but something in his training or perhaps his preconceptions kept him suspicious. Moving with deliberate slowness, the driver reached for his glove compartment. "I'm going to get my registration now," he announced clearly, a habit born from years of similar situations. As he did so, his father's pocket watch rolled slightly in the cup holder, catching the officer's attention. The officer's flashlight beam followed every movement. "This vehicle is registered to Riverside Heights," he stated, a note of skepticism creeping into his voice. "Is that your current address?" "Yes, it is," the driver replied, handling over his documents with steady hands. The papers were organized perfectly, a judge's habit. "I've lived there for the past 15 years. The officer studied the license and registration with unusual intensity, then looked back at the driver. "This is a new vehicle," he said, more of an accusation than a question. "Purchased recently?" "2 weeks ago," the driver confirmed, maintaining his composed demeanor despite the growing tension. "Is there a problem with that?" The officer's posture stiffened slightly. "We've had reports of luxury vehicles being stolen in this area. Your car matches a description we received." This wasn't entirely true. There had been no such recent reports, but it was a convenient excuse for the stop. The driver felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, one he carried since his first similar encounter decades ago. "Officer, I can assure you this vehicle is mine. I purchased it from Downtown Luxury Motors. You're welcome to contact them to verify." "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the officer commanded, his hand moving closer to his weapon. The situation was escalating. Driven by assumptions and biases neither man was fully acknowledging yet. The driver took a deep breath, considering his options. In his decades on the bench, he'd seen countless cases that started just like this. He knew every legal right he had, every procedure that should be followed. But he also knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. "Officer," he said calmly, "before I step out, I'd like to call your attention to something." He reached slowly into his suit jacket, causing the officer to tense visibly. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a federal judge's credentials. The officer's flashlight beam caught the gold badge and ID card. For a moment, time seemed to freeze on that quiet Atlanta street. The young officer's face went through a rapid series of emotions: surprise, disbelief, and then the slow dawn of realization. Around them, a few cars slowed as they passed, their drivers curious about the scene unfolding. Some had already pulled out their phones, recording what they probably thought would be another viral video of police misconduct. But something different was about to happen here, something that would change both men's lives in unexpected ways. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and generations of history. The judge could see the internal struggle playing out on the young officer's face, the battle between ingrained assumptions and the reality now staring him in the face. This moment could go two ways. It could become another statistic, another headline, or it could become something more powerful, a chance for real change. The badge gleamed under the streetlights, its golden surface reflecting years of service to justice. The young officer's radio crackled with distant chatter, but neither man moved. It was as if the whole world had narrowed down to this moment, this revelation on a quiet Atlanta street. I apologize, Your Honor," the officer finally managed, his voice losing its earlier edge of authority. He lowered his flashlight, but the damage was already done. Several cars had stopped nearby, their passengers watching the scene unfold with phones raised. The blue and red lights from the patrol car continued to paint the scene in alternating colors. The judge stayed quiet for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. He'd seen this exact moment of recognition hundreds of times before, in his courtroom, during traffic stops, even at high-end restaurants. That instant when someone's preconceptions crashed headfirst into reality. A second patrol car pulled up, its lights adding to the impromptu light show. The new arrival was an older officer, a veteran of the force who'd appeared before the judge many times over the years. The moment he stepped out of his car, his face showed immediate recognition. "Judge," the senior officer called out, hurrying over. "Is everything all right here?" His voice carried both respect and concern. The younger officer's face reddened as he realized just how badly he'd misread the situation. The judge finally stepped out of his car, his movements dignified and deliberate. He stood tall in his tailored suit, the kind of presence that commanded attention in any courtroom. "Good evening, Officer Chen," he said to the veteran cop, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. "Just a small misunderstanding, I believe." The younger officer was visibly struggling, his training warring with his embarrassment. "Sir, I was just following procedure," he began, but his voice trailed off as he realized how hollow those words sounded. More cars had stopped now, drawn by the unusual sight of 3 police cars with flashing lights. The judge noticed a news van pulling up slowly at the corner. Someone had probably called the station, hoping to capture another viral moment of conflict. But the judge had something else in mind. 25 years on the bench had taught him that real change rarely came from public humiliation. He turned to face the young officer directly, speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Officer," he said, his tone professional but not unkind, "I'd like you to think about something. When you ran my plates and saw they were registered to Riverside Heights, what image came to your mind about who would be driving this car?" The question hung in the air like heavy smoke. The young officer's silence was answer enough. Behind them, Officer Chen quietly asked the gathering crowd to move along, though several phones were still recording the scene. The judge continued, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in court. "I didn't become a judge to punish people, officer. I became a judge to help create justice, real justice, the kind that changes things." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Would you be willing to have a conversation about what happened here tonight? Not as a judge and officer, but as 2 people trying to make our community better." The younger officer looked up, surprise replacing his embarrassment. This wasn't how he'd expected this to go. The usual script called for anger, for accusations, for defensive posturing on both sides. Instead, he was being offered something entirely different. A chance to learn rather than just be punished. In the distance, a church bell tolled 9 times, its deep sounds rolling through the evening air. The judge's car ticked as its engine cooled, and somewhere nearby, a siren wailed briefly before fading away. It was just another night in Atlanta, but for these 2 men, it was becoming something more. A turning point that would ripple out far beyond this moment. By sunrise the next morning, shaky cell phone videos of the traffic stop had already spread across social media. Local news stations played clips on their morning broadcasts, but the story they told wasn't the one everyone expected. Instead of another angry confrontation, viewers saw something different, a moment of potential transformation. The police chief sat in his office, coffee growing cold as he watched the footage for the 4th time. Through the glass walls of his office, he could see reporters gathering in the lobby below. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. But what caught his attention wasn't the potential scandal. It was the judge's words about justice and change. Meanwhile, the young officer sat alone in the break room, his uniform feeling unusually heavy on his shoulders. His fellow officers passed by, some offering sympathetic looks, others keeping their distance. The morning shift briefing had been uncomfortable, filled with sideways glances and whispered conversations that stopped when he walked by. His sergeant had already called him in for a meeting. Administrative duty until further notice, she'd said, her face showing a mix of disappointment and concern. And the chief wants all your body camera footage from the last 3 months reviewed. The words felt like stones in his stomach, but deep down, he knew this was about more than just one traffic stop. Across town, in his chambers, the judge was dealing with his own flood of calls. Fellow judges, community leaders, and civil rights organizations all wanted to know what action he planned to take. His clerk had already rescheduled his morning docket, knowing this situation needed his full attention. The judge stood at his window, watching the city wake up. His phone buzzed again. Another news outlet requesting an interview, but his mind was on something else. He was thinking about his father, who'd faced similar situations decades ago, but never had the power to change anything. He was thinking about his own early days as a lawyer, about all the cases he'd seen where moments like this ended in bitterness and missed opportunities. The young officer's words from last night echoed in his mind. Just following procedure. How many times had he heard those exact words in his courtroom? How many times had he seen good intentions tangled up with unconscious bias? This wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about patterns that ran deep through the system. In the police department's public affairs office, phones rang constantly. Social media was buzzing with competing hashtags, some calling for the officer's badge, others defending him. But something unusual was happening in the comments. People were sharing their own stories, not just of confrontation, but of moments when understanding broke through. By midday, the chief of police had called an emergency meeting with his command staff. The department needed to respond, but the usual playbook didn't seem to fit. This wasn't a typical case of misconduct to be handled with suspension and sensitivity training. The judge's response had changed the conversation. The young officer sat in his car during lunch break, reading through messages on his phone. There were texts from family members, some supportive, others asking hard questions. A message from his police academy classmate caught his eye. Remember why you wanted to be a cop in the first place? He did remember. He'd wanted to help people, to make his community better. Somewhere between the academy and last night, something had shifted in how he saw things. The judge's question about his assumptions kept playing in his mind. Back in his chambers, the judge made a decision. He picked up his phone and called the police chief directly. "I have a proposal," he said, looking at the framed photo of his father on his desk. "This doesn't have to be just another headline. We can turn this into something that matters." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the city streets as news crews set up for their evening broadcasts. They were preparing to tell a story, but they didn't know yet that the real story was just beginning. A story about how one traffic stop might lead to real change in ways nobody expected. 3 days after the traffic stop, the young officer stood in the courthouse hallway, his civilian clothes feeling strange after years of wearing a uniform. The marble floors and wood-paneled walls seemed to watch him as he waited outside the judge's chambers. His hands kept fidgeting with his tie, the same one he'd worn to his police academy graduation. Inside his chambers, the judge was finishing up a phone call with a community leader who had strong opinions about how this situation should be handled. He glanced at the framed photos on his wall, images spanning decades of legal service, each one telling its own story about justice and change. A gentle knock on the door broke the silence. The judge's clerk stepped in. "He's here, Your Honor." The judge nodded, took a deep breath, and straightened his robes. This meeting wasn't about punishment. It was about building a bridge that should have been built long ago. The officer entered the chambers, his steps hesitant but determined. The room felt different from any courtroom he testified in before. It was smaller, more personal, with afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows and law books lining the walls from floor to ceiling. "Please, have a seat," the judge said, gesturing to a chair not across his desk, but in a small sitting area near the window. It was a subtle choice. This wasn't to be an interrogation or a reprimand, but a conversation between two people. The officer sat down, his back straight, hands resting nervously on his knees. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor. I know you must be very busy." His voice carried the weight of 3 sleepless nights spent thinking about what had happened. The judge poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher, another small gesture of humanity. "Do you know why I asked to meet with you?" he asked, handing 1 glass to the officer. "To be honest, sir, I'm not sure," the officer replied. "I expected to be suspended, maybe worse." He paused, gathering his courage. "The other officers, they say I'm lucky you haven't filed a complaint." The judge smiled slightly. Settling into his chair, "Let me tell you about my first car," he began, surprising the officer with this unexpected turn. "It was a beaten-up old Ford that my father helped me buy when I started law school. I got pulled over 11 times in the first year I owned it." The officer listened, his water untouched, as the judge continued. Each time, the reason was different. A taillight that wasn't out, a stop sign I hadn't run, suspicious behavior that simply meant driving while being black. The judge's voice wasn't angry, just matter-of-fact. "The last time it happened, I was already a practicing attorney. The officer who stopped me that night eventually became one of my strongest supporters on the bench. Want to know why?" The judge leaned forward slightly. "Because we had a conversation, much like the one we're having now." Outside the chambers, the usual bustle of courthouse activity continued. Lawyers hurried past with armloads of documents. Clients waited nervously on benches. Justice moved forward in its slow but steady way. But in this room, something special was happening. The officer found his voice. "I've been thinking about what you asked me that night, about my assumptions when I ran your plates." His hands tightened around the water glass. "I didn't like what I discovered about myself." The judge nodded encouragingly. "Recognition is the first step. But what matters now is what we do with this moment." He stood up and walked to his desk, picking up a folder. "I have an idea, but it will only work if you're willing to be part of something bigger than just this incident." The late afternoon sun painted golden stripes across the room as the two men began to talk about experiences, assumptions, and the possibility of real change. Outside the window, the city stretched out before them, unaware that in this quiet room, a small but significant transformation was beginning to take place. The judge walked to a cabinet in his chambers and pulled out an old, worn leather photo album. "Before we talk about the future," he said, returning to his seat, "I want to share something with you." He opened the album carefully, its pages crackling with age. The officer leaned forward, his nervousness temporarily forgotten. The first photo showed a small house with peeling paint, a worn bicycle propped against the porch. "This was home," the judge explained. "My father worked as a janitor at the courthouse, the same building we're sitting in now. He used to bring me here sometimes, let me sit in the empty courtrooms after hours." Turning the page, he revealed a black and white photo of a young boy wearing oversized glasses, standing proudly next to an older man in work clothes. "That's me and my father. He couldn't read very well, but he made sure I never missed a day of school. He'd tell me, 'Son, education is the key they can't take away from you.'" The officer listened intently, seeing a side of the judge that went beyond the stern figure in black robes. The next photo showed a young man in a graduation gown, beaming at the camera. "Law school graduation," the judge explained. "First in my family to go to college, let alone law school." That same night, driving home from the celebration, I got pulled over. The officer couldn't believe the car I was driving was mine. The young officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the parallel to their own encounter unmistakable. The judge noticed but continued, his voice remaining gentle. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because understanding comes from knowing each other's stories." Outside, the courthouse bells chimed 5 o'clock, but neither man moved to leave. The officer cleared his throat. "Can I share something too?" At the judge's encouraging nod, he continued. "My grandfather was a cop. He used to tell me stories about protecting people, serving the community. That's why I wanted to join the force." His voice grew quieter. "But sometimes, out there on patrol, it's like all that training about community service gets pushed aside by fear and suspicion. We're taught to be always alert, always watching for threats. Sometimes I think we start seeing threats everywhere, even where they don't exist." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Fear is a powerful thing," he said. "It can make us forget our common humanity." He turned to another page in the album, showing a photo of himself in judicial robes, taking the oath of office. "When I became a judge, I promised to uphold justice for everyone. But real justice isn't just about following laws. It's about seeing each person's full humanity. The late afternoon light was fading outside, casting long shadows across the room. The officer looked at the photo album, then back at the judge. That night, when I saw your credentials, it was like a mirror being held up. I saw all my assumptions laid bare. The judge closed the album gently. We all have assumptions, biases we might not even be aware of. The question is, what do we do when we recognize them? He leaned forward slightly. You could have gotten defensive that night. Instead, you're here, willing to have this conversation. I want to do better, the officer said simply. I just don't know how. The judge smiled, reaching for a folder on his desk. That's why I asked you here. I have an idea, but it will take commitment from both of us. He opened the folder, revealing a detailed proposal. What if we could turn this incident into a program that brings officers and community members together? Not just for one conversation, but for real, lasting change. As the judge outlined his plan, the officer felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about avoiding punishment or saving his career. It was about becoming part of something bigger, a chance to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community they served. The courthouse had grown quiet around them. Most of its daily bustle died down. But in this room, two men from different worlds were finding common ground, turning a moment of conflict into an opportunity for real understanding. 2 weeks after their conversation, the young officer found himself sitting in the back of the judge's courtroom. He wasn't there to testify. He was there to learn. The wooden bench felt different from this side. He watched as people from all walks of life came before the bench, each with their own story. The judge had designed the program carefully. It wasn't just about officers observing court proceedings. It was about understanding the human stories behind each case. During the morning break, the judge invited the officer into his chambers. What struck you about this morning's cases? The judge asked, removing his robes and sitting down with a cup of coffee. The officer thought for a moment, his notebook open on his lap. The teenager with the shoplifting charge, he replied slowly. How you took time to ask about his family, his school. I wouldn't have known his mom was sick, that he was trying to help with medical bills. His voice carried a new understanding. On the street, we don't always get to hear the whole story. The judge nodded approvingly. That's exactly why this program matters. But this is just the beginning. He pulled out a calendar marked with community events, town halls, and training sessions. Next week, you'll be joining me at the community center. The following week, the officer stood nervously before a room full of local residents. The community center's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he shared his story, not just about the traffic stop, but about his journey since then. The room was quiet, tense at first, but as he spoke honestly about his mistakes and his desire to change, something in the atmosphere shifted. An elderly woman raised her hand. My grandson wants to be a police officer, she said, her voice carrying years of worry. But I'm scared for him. Scared of how he'll be treated. Scared of what the job might turn him into. What would you tell him? The officer felt the weight of her question. He looked at the judge, who sat quietly in the back of the room, then back at the grandmother. I tell him that being a good officer means being part of the community, not apart from it. And I'm learning that every day. As weeks passed, the program grew. Other officers began requesting to participate. The judge's courtroom became a classroom of sorts, where law enforcement could see the justice system from a different angle. But it wasn't just about watching. Officers began sharing their own experiences, fears, and hopes with community members. The young officer started keeping a journal of his experiences. One entry read, "Today I saw a kid who reminded me of myself at that age. Before, I might have seen him as a potential threat. Now I saw a story waiting to be heard." During traffic stops, he found himself approaching cars differently. Instead of assuming the worst, he remembered the judge's words about seeing humanity first. His fellow officers noticed the change in him, and some began asking questions about the program. One rainy afternoon, He sat in on a domestic violence case. The victim was terrified, but the judge handled her testimony with such care and respect that she found the strength to tell her story. After court, the officer wrote in his journal, "Today I learned that true strength isn't about authority. It's about compassion." The local news did a story about the program. They interviewed community members who'd participated in the discussions. A teenager spoke about how his fear of police had lessened after getting to know officers as people. A veteran officer admitted that the program had changed how he approached his daily patrols. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during a community dinner at the local church. Officers and residents shared meals and stories. Their children played together. And for a few hours, the barriers that usually divided them seemed to fade away. The young officer watched it all, remembering how differently things could have turned out that night of the traffic stop. The judge stood at the back of the church hall, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. This was real change happening, not through force or fear, but through understanding and connection. One conversation at a time, one story at a time, bridges were being built. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The young officer stood before a new class of police cadets at the academy, his badge catching the fluorescent light. The room was quiet except for the soft scratch of pencils taking notes. This wasn't part of their regular training. This was something different. "I used to think being a good cop meant being tough, being suspicious," he told them, pacing slowly across the front of the classroom. "I thought I was doing my job right by assuming the worst in every situation." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I was wrong." At the back of the room, the judge sat quietly, watching the officer he'd come to know well over the past months. The young man speaking now was different from the nervous officer who'd stood in his chambers half a year ago. His voice carried confidence, but also humility. The officer shared the story of that night, not holding back about his assumptions and mistakes. But then he shared what happened after. The conversations, the learning, the change. He pulled out his patrol log from the previous week. "Last Thursday, I stopped a car in Riverside Heights," he said. "Before the program, I might have immediately assumed something was wrong. Instead, I approached with an open mind. Turned out the driver was a surgeon heading home from a 16-hour shift. We ended up having a great conversation about his community outreach program at the hospital." One cadet raised her hand. "But what about officer safety? We can't just let our guard down, can we?" The officer nodded thoughtfully. "Good question. Being alert and being biased are not the same thing. We can stay safe without letting fear and assumptions control our actions." He looked around the room. The safest communities are the ones where police and residents trust each other. During breaks between his regular patrols, the officer now volunteered at the same community center where he'd once nervously shared his story. He helped with homework clubs, coached youth basketball, and most importantly, listened to people's stories. The teenagers who used to scatter when police cars drove by now waved to him by name. His fellow officers noticed the change too. Some had been skeptical at first, calling him the judge's project. But results were hard to argue with. Complaints in his patrol area had dropped. Community members were more willing to share information about real crimes. Even traffic stops ended more positively. One evening, during a department meeting, the officer shared statistics from the program's first 6 months. Citizen complaints down 30%. Voluntary community cooperation up 45%. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. He talked about the relationships built, the trust earned, the understanding gained on both sides. The police chief, who'd initially viewed the program as just good PR, now sat forward in his chair, really listening. Other precincts were asking about implementing similar programs. The local news had done a follow-up story, showing officers and community members working together at neighborhood events. After the meeting, a veteran officer approached him. "Remember that night? The traffic stop?" The older officer asked. "I thought your career was over. Instead, you're changing how we all do our jobs." The young officer often reflected on how close he'd come to being another negative statistic, another example of what could go wrong. Instead, thanks to the judge's wisdom and his own willingness to learn, he'd become part of something transformative. Later that week, he pulled over another car. As he approached the driver's window, he remembered the judge's words about seeing humanity first. The driver was nervous, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The officer smiled, introduced himself by name, and asked how the driver's evening was going. It was a small moment, but these small moments were where real change began. That night, writing in his journal, the officer noted, "6 months ago, I thought I was losing my badge. Instead, I found my true calling. Being a police officer isn't about power. It's about service, understanding, and building bridges. Every day, I try to be the kind of officer I needed to meet that night." 1 year after that life-changing traffic stop, the courthouse auditorium was packed. Police officers, community members, judges, and civic leaders filled every seat. The occasion: the first graduation ceremony for what had become known as the Bridge Program, an initiative that had grown far beyond one judge and one officer. The young officer, now a program coordinator, stood at the podium adjusting the microphone. Behind him sat the judge, along with 20 officers and 20 community leaders who had completed the intensive 6-month program. Looking out at the audience, he saw familiar faces from his own journey. A year ago, he began, his voice steady and clear. "I made a mistake that could have ended my career. Instead, it became the beginning of something extraordinary." He gestured to the judge. Thanks to one person's wisdom, a moment of conflict became an opportunity for change. In the front row, he spotted the grandmother who'd asked about her grandson at that first community meeting. Her grandson was now enrolled in the police academy, and she had become one of the program's most passionate community advocates. The judge took the podium next, his robes replaced by a simple suit for this occasion. "When I was a young lawyer," he shared, "I dreamed of changing the system from the bench. What I've learned is that real change happens in the streets, in community centers, in everyday interactions between police and citizens." The program had evolved beyond their initial vision. What started as courthouse observations and community discussions had grown into a comprehensive initiative. Police officers spent time working in community services. Community leaders went on patrol ride-alongs. Everyone involved had to walk in someone else's shoes. A local high school student stood to share how the program had affected her neighborhood. "Last year, we used to run when we saw police cars," she said. "Now we know the officers by name. They come to our basketball games, help with our college applications, and actually listen to our stories." The chief of police, who'd initially been skeptical, presented data showing dramatic improvements in police-community relations across participating precincts. Complaint rates had dropped, cooperative tip-offs had increased, and most importantly, trust was building on both sides. Other cities had taken notice. Representatives from police departments across the country sat in the audience, taking notes and asking questions. The program was being adapted for different communities, each version tailored to local needs, but maintaining the core principle. Understanding comes through genuine connection. The young officer returned to the podium to share a recent story. "Last week, I responded to a call that could have gone badly. A teenager, a misunderstanding, a scared parent. But because of what I've learned, I took the time to listen. Instead of an arrest, we found a solution. The teenager is now in counseling, and the family is getting the support they need." As certificates were handed out, each recipient, officer and community member alike, shared one lesson they'd learned. Their words painted a picture of transformed perspectives on both sides. Officers spoke about seeing beyond their initial assumptions. Community members described their growing understanding of law enforcement challenges. The judge concluded the ceremony with a simple truth. Change doesn't happen in grand moments. It happens in small interactions, in daily choices to see each other's humanity. What started with a traffic stop has become a movement, but the real work happens one conversation at a time. Later that evening, as the auditorium emptied, The officer and the judge stood looking at a wall of photos documenting the program's first year. There were pictures of community meetings, ride-alongs, youth programs, and countless moments of connection. "Did you ever imagine this?" the officer asked, gesturing to the photos. The judge smiled, remembering their first conversation in his chambers. "I imagined change was possible," he replied. "But this is better than anything I could have imagined. This is real transformation." As they walked out into the evening, they passed a new class of program participants gathering for their first session. The cycle would begin again. More stories shared, more bridges built, more understanding gained. What had started as a potential tragedy had become a legacy of hope and change, one human connection at a time.